Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. So while some people are calling on everyone to turn down the temperature because of all the political violence in America, it looks so far like the assassination of Charlie Kirk is amping up the rhetoric from President Trump and many of his allies. And here's the part we're going to talk about in this segment. Not just the rhetoric. Lots of people on all kinds of sides say all kinds of things, but actions that might impinge upon a free and fair election in next year's congressional midterms. Briefly on the rhetoric, we have headlines like these over the weekend. CNN, Trump has turned up the temperature after Kirk's killing. Spencer Cox, the governor of Utah, is trying to turn it back down. Similarly, the New York Times says Trump vows vengeance. Utah's governor calls to lower the temperature. Now, Politico reported on turning up the temperature in words and in possible election-related deeds in several pieces over the weekend. One of their newsletter headlines was called How Kirk's Death is Fueling Republicans' Redistricting Race. It said President Donald Trump's already brass-knuckle push for red state redistricting is taking on an increasingly apocalyptic valence among MAGA stalwarts following the killing of Charlie Kirk. The article focused on a meeting of conservatives in Indiana over the weekend that had been scheduled before the killing. It cites Alex Brusiewicz, a top Trump advisor and longtime friend of Kirk, who the article says made the case to what they call still hesitant Indiana lawmakers for a congressional map that delivers Republicans all 9 Indiana districts, carving up Democratic-held areas in Indianapolis and Northwest Indiana. Those are the 2 areas of the states with Democrats in Congress. And it quotes Republican Senator Jim Banks of Indiana at the conference saying, they killed Charlie Kirk, as if the Democratic Party did it. That was in contrast to what Utah's Republican Governor Cox, who he mentioned, made a point of saying Friday as the Times spotlights. Cox said, there is one person responsible for what happened here, and that person is now in custody and will be charged soon and will be held accountable. But Senator Banks, at the Indiana conference he sponsored, said, they killed Charlie Kirk. The least we can do is go through a legal process and redistrict Indiana into a 9-0 map, as if tilting the elections is a form of vengeance. And that's where we'll begin to dive into potential midterm elections hardball, which we should say was already going on. We had already planned to speak with Ari Berman, our guest, Mother Jones National Voting Rights correspondent, on his latest article about this. In fact, he was scheduled for last Thursday's show, but we postponed him so we could spend more time covering the aftermath of the killing. But Ari Berman joins us today in this now somewhat altered context. He's also author of the books Minority Rule, The Right-Wing Attack on the Will of the People, and Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. His Mother Jones article about the strategy toward the midterms is called Project 2026. It lists 10 ways, 10, that he writes Trump and his allies are tilting the midterms in their favor before anyone has cast a vote. He writes, one of the 10 involves this quote after President Trump met with Vladimir Putin last month. Vladimir Putin, that hero of free and fair elections. And Trump came out saying this.
Vladimir Putin said something, one of the most interesting things. He said, your election was rigged because you have mail-in voting. He said mail-in voting, every election. He said no country has mail-in voting. It's impossible to have mail-in voting and have honest elections. And he said that to me. It was very interesting because we talked about 2020. He said, you won that election by so much. And that's how he got it. He said, and if you would have won, we wouldn't have had a war. You'd have all these millions of people alive now instead of dead. And he said, and you lost it because of mail-in voting. It was a rigged election, but mail-in voting.
And with Vladimir Putin being cited as a champion of honest elections, Ari Berman, thanks for joining us. Welcome back to WNYC.
Hey, Brian. Great to talk to you again. Thank you.
Was Trump accurate there, citing Putin, that no other country has mail-in voting?
No, he wasn't accurate. Basically, none of what he said was accurate. And I think citing Vladimir Putin as an expert on free and fair elections is pretty shocking in its own right. Russia is not exactly known for a flourishing democracy under Putin. But no, plenty of countries have mail-in elections. Lots of countries use it. The United States has used it for quite some time. It was relatively uncontroversial until 2020, when Trump didn't like that more Democrats than Republicans suddenly started voting by mail because they took the pandemic more seriously. And so Trump cited Putin because Trump wants to issue another executive order that hasn't come out yet, but I assume is still forthcoming, that the president says he wants to ban mail-in voting. Now, the president doesn't have the power to do that because the state legislatures and Congress set the rules for how elections work on both the state and the federal level. But nonetheless, I think it's indicative of the lengths that the president is trying to go to influence the midterm elections in his party's favor by changing the mechanics of who can and can't vote.
And the Trump-Putin clip and that topic of mail-in voting was in your item number 1 on your list of 10 ways that are already underway to try to tilt the results of the 2026 elections. Item number 1 that you call nationalizing voter suppression. What else is in that item?
Well, it's really unusual, first off, that the president of the United States is trying so hard to change voting procedures because, as I just said, that is something that is widely established to be the power of both the states and the Congress. And normally, if presidents want to change laws, they go through the Congress. But Trump is not trying to do that. He's trying to do this through executive action. So he issued an executive order back in March that would change how voting works in a number of different ways. He wanted to require proof of citizenship to register to vote for federal elections, so something like a passport or a birth certificate. Millions of Americans don't have those documents or don't carry those documents around with them on a regular basis. He wanted to say that mail-in ballots must be received by Election Day, as opposed to postmarked by Election Day, which is the rules in 17 states. He wanted to give DOJ and the Department of Homeland Security the power to go through state voter rolls. And there was one really interesting part of that executive order that didn't get that much attention, but he said he wanted to rescind the certifications of current voting equipment and require new equipment that's actually not currently available. And a lot of election experts are worried that Trump is basically going to say, well, the voting machines were rigged, and he's going to use that as an excuse to try in some capacity to challenge the results of the midterm. So that was just one executive order back in March. The president has since gone further, saying he wants to ban mail-in voting, saying he wants to get rid of voting machines. There's a lot of concern about him sending federal troops into Democratic cities, places like Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., and what that could mean for elections. Could you have the military patrolling the polls? Could ICE be at polling places? There is already a lot of dangerous rhetoric coming from Trump's allies. You had Cleta Mitchell, a former Trump lawyer who tried to overturn the 2020 election, basically saying that she believes that Trump is going to, in her words, exercise some emergency powers to take over the election process. So
let me play that clip. I pulled that clip after reading it in your article, and I thought that was very relevant. And by the way, folks, we're still in item number 1 of the 10 ways that Ari Berman and Mother Jones wrote up that there are attempts to tilt the election in advance of the 2026 midterms. These are all, 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 1E. And I think the overarching thing that you're talking about here, Ari, is whatever power the president has to interfere or to direct, let's say, how elections are carried out, because that's typically a state function. So you did cite Trump attorney Cleta Mitchell, on a Jody Heiss podcast just this month, arguing that Trump does have the power to call a national emergency, and we know that's one of the things he does. He declares states of emergency to take more power over state election procedures. Here's that clip.
But look, I mean, the president's authority is limited. The chief executive is limited in his role with regard to elections, except that where there is a threat to the national sovereignty of the United States, as I think that we can establish with the porous system that we have, then I think maybe the president is thinking that he will exercise some emergency powers to protect the federal elections going forward.
So emergency powers, and she hangs it on national security. Do you understand what she's getting at there for something that Trump might hypothetically do?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there were things, for example, that Trump considered in 2020, doing things like seizing voting machines in battleground states that he ultimately did not do because he was persuaded not to do those things. And I think the concern here is that Trump is more likely to try to do those kind of things now because all the people that might have talked him out of it are gone from his administration, and his outside allies, people like Cleta Mitchell, people like Steve Bannon, are openly saying things like the president could exercise these emergency powers to take over the election, or we could have ICE at polling places. That was something that Steve Bannon said. So a lot of these things at the beginning seemed like conspiracy theories about what Trump might do. And now his allies are basically coming out and saying it. Whereas Trump keeps having increasingly apocalyptic rhetoric about the elections, talking about not only the 2020 election being rigged, but already seeming to blame mail voting, seeming to blame voting machines for what might happen in 2026, already taking executive authority in lots of different avenues, including with the voting process, but obviously going much further in things like deploying the National Guard to LA and DC. And so there's just a lot of concern about things Trump might do that no other president has considered doing in an election contest, Republican or Democrat, and whether or not they're legal, that doesn't seem to be something that's going to deter the president from trying to do them.
Let me back up and go over a couple of hypotheticals that you mentioned along the way there. One is that the mass deportation agenda with ICE and National Guard deployments could overlap into some kind of election intimidation, I guess is how you're characterizing it. You're talking about ICE being deployed near the polls. What could they even do near a voting place that would affect anything about how people vote?
Well, that's a good question because we've never seen that kind of thing before, but you certainly could see them stationed just outside polling places, which in and of itself could deter people from voting. You could have, for example, the military try to seize voting machines. We already know that the president considered that in 2020. We already know that the executive order that he issued talks about rescinding certifications on voting machines. And we also know that the Justice Department has been trying to get access to voting equipment in states like Missouri, which is also extremely unusual. So you could have the military play some roles in terms of equipment, things like that. But I think it's less about them changing individual votes and more about an atmosphere of intimidation where people feel afraid to go out and vote because it's basically a police state. And we had, not that long ago in our country, we had, for example, people being given poll tests and literacy tests and the federal government and state governments being used in a very intimidating way to disenfranchise people. And it's not hard to imagine some of those tactics being brought back, not maybe in terms of the letter of the law, but in terms of the actual ambiance of what it's like when people try to cast their ballot. If voting seems difficult and scary, some people may just decide not to do it because they don't want to go through the hassle.
You were citing Jim Crow era practices, but kind of related to what you were just saying about deploying ICE. I mean, in that nationalizing voter suppression section you mentioned, and you mentioned it here already, Trump's call for proof of citizenship to register to vote. On that one, a lot of people might think, well, why would that be so objectionable? Being a citizen is basically the only requirement for eligibility besides, I guess, age and residency in the voting district. And by extension, if you're a citizen and going to legally cast a ballot, you don't have to worry about ICE. So what would you say to those?
Well, I think the problem is that having to show a passport or a birth certificate when you register to vote is beyond what is currently required in nearly every state. And it's very burdensome because when Kansas tried to do this not too long ago, that requirement blocked 1 in 7 people, 1 in 7 new registrants from registering to vote. And these were all American citizens. But the problem was they did not carry things like a passport or a birth certificate around with them when they register to vote. This is not just voter ID as we think about it, Brian. This is not a driver's license. These are documents that people either don't have or they don't carry around with them on a regular basis. So I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that people could be disenfranchised. You could imagine a scenario where the law is not even in effect, but ICE is going around asking people for citizenship papers. People might not carry those around with them. People might have relatives who have different kinds of legal status. We've already seen American citizens being deported or attempted to be deported by this administration. And so there's a climate of fear because of the Trump administration's immigration policies that could then be used to weaponize what their election policies might be. And that's something that's not just going to keep undocumented people away because they already are not voting. That's something that could then keep American citizens away because they don't have that documentation, or they're just afraid to show up because they don't want to be harassed by the federal government.
Listeners, we invite your calls with questions or comments or concerns or even experiences on attempts to tilt next year's midterm elections already going on now. Your concerns about actual voter fraud, also welcome. Voter suppression or anything related, 212-433-WNYC for Ari Berman, voting rights correspondent for Mother Jones. His article called Project 2026, 212-433-WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. Just backing up for a second on mail-in voting, I was looking up to see if there are any examples or any meaningful examples of mail-in voter fraud. And I really couldn't come up with any. What I came up with was all these things that you can find in a Google search about why it's secure. Like after the 2020 election, Trump's lawyers, trying to challenge the results, of course, never presented any evidence in court that mail-in voting flipped the result anywhere. They only challenged it on technical grounds. There was a report from the Bipartisan Policy Center, which by definition is bipartisan, and concluded it's not a threat to election integrity. And I found this really interesting one from the American Statistical Association. This was just before the election in 2020, came out that October. And they did a statistical analysis to try to answer the question as they framed it: does voting by mail increase fraud? Estimating the change in reported voter fraud when states switch to elections by mail. And so they compared voter fraud cases in states with or without mail-in voting in October 2020, looking at elections before that. And their conclusion was, quote, "We find no evidence that voting by mail increases the risk of voter fraud overall. Moreover, we estimate that Washington, I think that means Washington State, we estimate Washington would have reported 80 more cases of fraud had it not introduced its vote by mail law in 2011. That's interesting, right?
That is interesting. I mean, the 2020 election was probably the most scrutinized election in American history in terms of voter fraud claims. And every credible expert and every credible authority that looked at that election concluded there was no voter fraud. You had the Department of Homeland Security say it was the most secure election in American history. And
that was under Trump, right?
That was under Trump.
Department of Homeland Security in the run-up to January 6th.
Yes, and this was the election where mail-in voting was used at the highest levels in American history. So we had the most secure election in American history with mail-in voting at the highest numbers. And they've never been able to substantiate any kind of these claims. I think people have this mistaken impression of mail-in voting where you get a ballot and you don't have to prove who you are. You have to prove who you are with mail-in voting, just like any other form of voting. You have to put some kind of ID number or some kind of record that election officials are going to match in the databases to prove that you are who you say you are. The only difference is that you're voting remotely as opposed to voting in person, but the same kind of requirements apply. And interestingly enough, one of the reasons why Republicans did better in 2024 is they started urging people to vote by mail again, despite Trump's claims. They said to people, vote early if you want to, vote by mail if you want to, vote however is most convenient for you. Because the reason why Republicans initially used mail voting in larger number than Democrats is because they had more rural voters. They had more elderly voters. They had voters who had more difficulty getting to the polls. So Trump's rhetoric about mail-in voting, both in 2020 and now, is very at odds with the fact that lots of Republicans have used mail voting. Lots of Republicans have continued to use mail voting. And actually, it's something that a lot of Republican operatives want their voters to use to try to increase turnout in the elections.
Here are some texts that are coming in. One says, hi, I enjoy the show, but really can't understand why it's so egregious to ask people to produce a federal document to register. Another one says, needn't go back to Jim Crow for voter intimidation. Florida arrested ex-convicts who had been told they were eligible to vote for doing so. I'm going to ask you to verify that. I'm not familiar with that incident. Another listener actually asks, they verify, is already popped off my screen. Sorry, these texts go by fast, but I'm paraphrasing the gist. And it was that since they verify mail-in voting by looking at your signature, they know who you are, and therefore they can know how you as an individual voted. Should I be concerned about that? So what would you say to any of those texts?
Well, I'm going to take the one about Florida first, because that is a really good example of voter intimidation happening in recent years. So in 2018, Florida voters passed a ballot initiative restoring voting rights to people with past felony convictions, because Florida was one of only a handful of states that didn't allow you to vote if you had a felony conviction, and that disenfranchised over 1 million people. So Florida voters passed this ballot initiative restoring voting rights to ex-offenders. Then the Florida legislature changes that law and says that people have to pay all fines, fees, and restitution to be able to vote. And a lot of people owed fines because of the way the criminal justice system worked in Florida. So they weren't sure if they were eligible to vote. There was a lot of gray area if people who had served their time and thought they were eligible to vote, if they actually could be able to cast a ballot. And what the governor of Florida said is, he said, Ron DeSantis, he said, we found all these incidents of fraud. And the incidents of fraud were actually people who had served their time, paid their debt to society, thought they were eligible to vote, were told by election officials they were eligible to vote, but then the state claimed they were ineligible. What you had is, you had police come to people's doors and arrest them. And the people were shocked, and they said, why am I being arrested? And they said, you're being arrested for voting. And so it was this very intimidating thing. You could look up the videos online. There's armed officers showing up at people's doors and basically arresting them when the ex-offenders thought they had a clean record, wanted to vote, and now they're threatened with going back to jail simply for the act of voting when they were told they were eligible. So it was an example of how a state was using its power to try to intimidate people into making voting seem scary, or in this case, perhaps even criminal. And that was a specific example. But it's the kind of voter intimidation tactic that I think is relevant when you hear Trump attack the voting process and saying he wants to go after certain people and tilt the voting system in his favor in one way or another.
A few more texts. One Critical One says, I was with your guest up until he mentioned ICE being stationed at the polls. To me, this is a form of gaslighting. What citizen that has the right to vote will be concerned about ICE being at the polls? This is how the right wins these types of arguments. And I'm not going to make you go over it again, but you explained how you think, in your view, that could wind up intimidating people who would be legal voters. Here's that one that I was starting to paraphrase so I can get as specific as possible a response from you. Listener writes, when you use a mail-in ballot, it is opened and your signature is verified. Could a record be kept of my name and who I voted for by nefarious people? This says, could a mail-in ballot put me at risk if I vote against a person in power? And I think that's the specific concern that this listener has. Could a mail-in ballot put me at risk if I vote against a person in power? And they know it because they open and they look who, my signature and who I am.
Well, I don't see how that's really any different than how you currently would do it, because I mean, when I vote, now I sign my name and I check in person to the polls and they verify my signature. They know who I am, and then I cast my ballot and I put it in my machine. I guess the difference is there that I was anonymous. With mail voting, yes, you would put your name on it or you'd have some kind of identifying feature, but that is kept private. So I've never heard of that. I've never heard of someone then using mail ballots to compile a list of somebody and saying, now we know how people cast their ballot. I've never heard of that, so that's not something that I would be concerned about.
Another listener writes, would the Speaker support compromise legislation that would provide for a national holiday for federal elections coupled with national voter ID?
I think that would be problematic because, first off, a national holiday sounds good in practice, but the problem is if there's a national holiday, first, a lot of things shut down, so it might actually not make the voting process easier. It would also mean that if there's no school, for example, I have two kids who are 10 and 7. If there's no school, it doesn't necessarily make it easier for me to vote if I have my kids with me and it's no longer a work day. I think it would be convenient to give people time off to vote. I think that's something that should be done. But a national holiday has some unintended consequences. So I think if you're going to cut some kind of deal for voter ID, it would have to be to expand voting access in some other kind of way. For example, let's say there was a compromise where you had voter ID, but then you also had guaranteed access to mail-in voting, guaranteed access to early voting. I could see some kind of compromise being cut in that way. States have cut compromises like that in other places. So that's the kind of compromise I think would be possible, which is to say, fine, let's compromise on the ID front, but let's expand voting access in other ways so that people aren't disenfranchised. The problem with the ID thing is that you'd have to have some mechanism in which everyone gets the ID that's now required. There are plenty of places that do that. There's lots of European countries, Brian, in which they give everyone an ID, so there's no fights over voter ID, and they automatically register everyone to vote. So there's no fight over voter registration. If you did something like that, then I wouldn't see a problem with that. But we've seen examples of states, for example, that require ID, and then in places like Texas or places like Alabama, they're closing DMV offices and making it hard to get the ID at the places where you need to get them.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, my guest is Ari Berman, Mother Jones National Voting Rights Correspondent, on his article called Project 2026. It lists 10 ways that he writes Trump and his allies are tilting the midterms in their favor before anyone has cast a vote. And we're already like 2/3 of the way through this segment, and we've only gotten through number 1, that he calls nationalizing voter suppression, because there are so many items within that. We're going to take a break and go on to item number 2 and see how close to all 10 we can get. And more of your calls and texts, 212-433-WNYC. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue with Ari Berman, Mother Jones Voting Rights Correspondent, on his new article, Project 2026, that lists 10 ways that he writes Trump and his allies are tilting the midterms in their favor before anyone has cast a vote. I want to jump ahead to your item number 9, because it's the focus that I mentioned in the intro, which is a half hour ago now, front and center after the killing of Charlie Kirk at the Indiana Conservative Conference over the weekend. It was ramping up redistricting efforts. We know about Texas. We know about the Democrats' response in California. There are things going on in other Democratic and Republican-controlled states. Indiana is an example where the fervor to do something after Kirk's death was invoked this weekend, according to Politico, to increase a push to eliminate the 2 Democratic congressional districts out of the 9 in the Hoosier state. What's the big picture as you see it?
Well, the big picture is that Trump is normalizing something that is very abnormal, which is mid-decade redistricting. Redistricting is something that's supposed to happen at the beginning of the decade after the census comes out. It started with Texas, with Trump pressuring Texas to redraw its districts just to give him and the Republican Party 5 more seats. That was extremely unusual. And it's continuing after Texas. Missouri passed a map on Friday that would eliminate 1 Democratic seat. There's only 2 in that state, so they've already passed a map. This was overshadowed by the Charlie Kirk news that would eliminate 1 of 2 Democrats in the state. This is something that Missouri Republicans previously declined to do, but Trump got involved, and so they did it. And now we're seeing Indiana being pressured to do so, to eliminate 2 Democratic districts so that there will be no Democratic representatives if they go forward with it. Other states are being pressured or considering this. Florida, Ohio is going to go through with it. And so this is just something that's extremely unusual, Brian. Absent a court order, states almost never draw new maps mid-decade. And now they are drawing new maps in a number of states. It could be more than a half dozen, simply for the purpose of making it harder for the House to change hands so that Trump doesn't face any accountability if there's a Democratic Congress. And I think this is probably the most effective tactic that Trump's used to try to influence the midterms, because you're actually just changing the composition of districts. The other things may or may not work, but this kind of gerrymandering is very, very hard to counteract.
I've heard multiple Republicans say, well, the Democrats started it, and they cite Illinois, they cite New York, they cite California. I'm in New York. The New York example is not really right, but it's interesting. New York had done sort of the opposite. They passed by voter referendum back in 2014, I think it was, a state policy that there would be an independent redistricting commission, not controlled by either party. But when that commission failed in its attempt, because they couldn't come to consensus between the Democrats and the Republicans on the commission to redistrict their way after the 2020 census, then it fell to the Democratic-controlled legislature, and they did try a partisan redistricting that got thrown out by New York's Democratic-appointed Court of Appeals. Yeah. There were guardrails in New York. There are not guardrails in Texas that would make that attempt fail in the same way, apparently. What about Illinois? Why do they keep citing Illinois as kind of starting this whole round?
Well, I don't think Illinois started it. Illinois is a state that's gerrymandered in the Democrats' favor, just like there's lots of states that are gerrymandered in the Republicans' favor. So it's certainly true that both sides have used gerrymandering. I think it's also true that Democrats have been more willing to try to ban gerrymandering through things like independent commissions, and also at the federal level. You may remember, Brian, there was federal voting rights legislation during the Biden era, and one of the things that bill, the For the People Act, would have done was ban gerrymandering at the federal level. And every Democrat but 3 members of Congress voted to ban gerrymandering, and every Republican opposed it. So the parties have very different positions on that. But I think you also have to draw a distinction between redistricting as it happens once a decade and mid-decade redistricting. And what Trump is doing, putting pressure on states to redraw their maps mid-decade, that is almost completely unprecedented. It's almost completely unprecedented for states to do it. And it's absolutely unprecedented for the president of the United States to call on states to do this. This was not something that a previous Republican or a previous Democratic president had ever done. So Trump is injecting himself into the redistricting process in a way that no other president has ever done at the mid-decade level, or at any level for that matter. And so that's what really makes this distinct. And that's what makes what Texas did very different from what Illinois might have done in terms of following the normal processes.
Let's take a phone call. Here's Mary Ellen in Westchester. You're on WNYC with Ari Berman, Mother Jones voting rights correspondent. Hi, Mary Ellen.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I just wanted to point out, going back to what you were talking about before, and someone had put in a comment saying that, well, what's the big deal about requiring government identification? That's the type of argument that superficially sounds okay. But when you actually delve into what the Trump administration is trying to do, for example, with the SAVE Act, which passed the House a while ago, the so-called SAVE Act, I would call it suppressing voting, not saving it. That would require the types of government-issued documentation that people don't have or that doesn't match their current names. For example, it would disenfranchise a lot of married women who changed their names when they got married, who have been voting forever, for years and years, without any problem, and suddenly they would be required to produce documents such as a birth certificate, which even if they carry it with them, the issue is not so much whether they carry it with them, it doesn't match their the birth certificate doesn't match their current legal name.
Let me get a response to that. How do they do that now? I don't know. My mom, she was born Ruth Waldman, and then got married to my dad and became Ruth Lehrer. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. But she never had any trouble registering to vote. So what about that listener's concern?
Yeah, that was a big concern that was raised when Congress tried to pass this bill known as the SAVE Act to require proof of citizenship to register to vote. And there was a study by the Brennan Center for Justice that found that 67 million married women could potentially have problems casting a ballot because their names had changed when they got married. And this was basically thought of as a poll tax on married women, that they were going to be treated differently because their names had changed. And if they showed their birth certificate, it would be a different last name, and they would have to get some kind of supporting documentation explaining it. Interestingly enough, Republican women were more likely to change their name and take their partner's names. And so this was something that may have had some unintended consequences. And it may be one reason why the SAVE Act isn't really moving in the U.S. Senate after it passed the U.S. House, because this is something that could disenfranchise lots of Republican voters as well, which I always say is, even if one party is making it harder to vote, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be friendly fire in terms of who might be affected by these kind of things. And so with all of these things, you have to dig a little bit deeper. It's not just about requiring some kind of identification. It's about the specifics of how it's required. And often more people are impacted by these kind of laws than you would initially think.
By the way, to the listener who is concerned about their signature, identifying them, and mail-in ballots, a few people have written in now to say things like this. Listener writes, Brian, I haven't voted absentee in a while, but there are 2 envelopes, no signature on the actual ballot, just like there is no signature on the in-person ballot. And that, as far as it goes, is true. Let's go on and back up to your item number 2. We're not going to get through, even a large minority of your 10 ways that the election is already being tilted in advance of next year's midterms. But item number 2 is the president and his allies, you write, are trying to silence his enemies. You cite another executive order, one on April 24th. What was that?
Well, there was multiple executive orders in April, but I think the one you're referring to is targeting Act Blue, which is the online platform where Democrats have raised a lot of money from, millions and millions of dollars. And Trump investigated them, I think, because it was so effective in raising money for Democrats, and said he wanted the attorney general to issue a report on whether there would be criminal charges against this group. And he's also done a lot of the same kind of things with people involved in the election processes. So he's not just going against Democratic affiliated groups. He's going against election officials, for example, that defended the validity of the 2020 election. He's trying to strip their security clearances, doing things like that. He's going after law firms that defended Democrats or defended nonprofit groups. And I think this is concerning because, first off, I think he's trying to gut the infrastructure that could be used to support Democrats, progressives. But I think he's also going after the election process itself. And I think the fear is that if Trump once again tries to challenge the validity of the elections in 2026 or in 2028, the people that spoke out in 2020 against that, they will be afraid to do so again for fear of retribution.
And, you know, having just read your article last week before Charlie Kirk was assassinated, I couldn't help but think of the kinds of things that you were just citing when I heard Trump's first statement from the White House after the murder, kind of turning up the temperature. Tell me if you think this signals more like what you were just describing.
Yeah, I mean, I think
listen to the clip. Hang on.
For years, those on the radical left have compared wonderful Americans like Charlie to Nazis and the world's worst mass murderers and criminals. This kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for the terrorism that we're seeing in our country today, and it must stop right now.
Sorry, that was not the part I meant to pull. That was my error. But he did talk about, and I could look up the reference, but I think it'll take me too long, kind of going after them. So I wonder if you heard his statement in the context of your beat, the battle over advantage in next year's midterm elections.
I did, because, you know, I could imagine him going after groups that do voter registration work, get out the vote efforts, pro-democracy organizations. You could imagine this being used to go after groups like the ACLU, for example, and it just be another thing, another excuse for the president to go after people that he believes are at odds with his agenda. Now, I think they were going to do this regardless, but they rarely let this kind of crisis go to waste. And so they're definitely going to try to, you've already heard it in the rhetoric, but they're definitely going to try to use Kirk's assassination as another way to try to increase federal power to go after people that the president and his allies don't like. And I think that's dangerous. And I think that's totally at odds with what should be done in the wake of this kind of assassination, which is try to unite the country. But I think Trump's going to use it to try to further divide the country. And I think he's going to use it in a way that tries to, in a lot of ways, do things that he believes are going to benefit himself and his party, as opposed to trying to bring the country together in some form or another.
Yeah, here's a New York Times headline that doesn't have the exact quote that I was referencing from last week, but refers to things that Trump has said even since. New York Times headline over the weekend: Trump downplays violence on the right and says the left is the problem. Says President Trump seemed to excuse violence from right-wing or other supporters and promised investigations into who was funding and organizing the left. And he had said something similar in that initial statement from the White House. But it's that promised investigations into who was funding and organizing the left. Well, what do they mean by the left? You know, I imagine they're not talking about just like militia groups, you know, that are actually organizing some kind of violence, to the extent that those even exist, but things like going after Act Blue, Democratic fundraising arm, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, they've done this. They've gone after law firms. They've gone after universities. They've gone after places that you wouldn't even think would be categorized as the left and aren't categorized as the left. And so that's why they could go after groups that have received money from George Soros, for example, which is a lot of organizations, or they could go after groups that have been critical of the kind of rhetoric and policies that have been promoted by people like Charlie Kirk and groups that have criticized the administration. And a lot of the people they're going after and a lot of people that Trump has categorized as his enemies, you would not think of as the left. You would not think of as Democrats. We talked about, for example, that the Department of Homeland Security declared the 2020 election the most secure in American history. Well, that came from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency called CISA, and Trump fired the director of that group, Chris Krebs. And not only that, but then he stripped Krebs of his security clearance. Krebs had to leave his job in the private sector because they were going to go after his colleagues. And that's just one example of Trump going after people that really were nonpartisan or apolitical that worked in the election process. And right now we haven't even talked about what the Department of Justice is doing, but they're talking about potentially criminally charging election officials. They're trying to get access to voter registration records. They're trying to get access to voting machines. And so you really could see the administration weaponized to go after people that are front and center in the election process, whether or not it's election officials themselves, whether or not it's groups that work on election issues. You could easily see Trump shifting from going after his political opponents to categorizing that in the broadest possible ways to go after people that are heavily involved in the election process, to either pursue an agenda that would make it easier for Republicans to win, or pursue an agenda that would then challenge the validity of the election system and not have people stand up in response to that like they did in 2020.
We're already over time. I want to ask you about one final thing that I just can't ignore. But listeners, this article is framed by Ari Berman of Mother Jones as 10 ways that Team Trump is trying to tilt the 2026 midterm election results even now. It's really like 100 ways, because each of these items has A, B, C, D, E, F, G, not listed like that by letters, but there are so many in some of them. The one that I really want to mention is what you call state-level voter suppression and election subversion, because this is who really controls and certifies elections in the United States, right? Unless Trump succeeds, which might be fairly unlikely, in declaring some kind of national emergency and federalizing the election. There were already some close calls on that score after the 2020 election, during that battle, the run-up to January 6th, and there have been a lot of changes in Republican-led states, especially, as to who controls election rules and election certification. And I wonder how much that's on your radar screen, and then we're out of time.
It's definitely on my radar screen. I mean, I'll just give you the example of North Carolina. That's a place in 2024 where a Republican state Supreme Court candidate tried to overturn the election. He came very close. Both the state court of appeals and the state Supreme Court were ready to throw out enough ballots to potentially declare him the winner until the federal court stepped in. But at the same time that happened, you had the state board of elections flip from Democratic control to Republican control because of a law that was passed by the North Carolina legislature, which is controlled by Republicans. So now the North Carolina Board of Elections, which is the place that both certifies elections on the state and county level, that is under Republican control. And it's not just under Republican control, but it's under control of people that have questioned the election process, that have tried to cut back on voting access, that have made false claims of voter fraud. And those are the people that, when it comes time to certify the results, they're going to be the body that signs off on that. And we saw Trump go state by state.
And North Carolina is interesting because in many ways it's still a purple state, swing state.
Still a purple state, very much so. And we saw Trump try to do this state by state by state in 2020. and fail. But we've seen that whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in North Carolina, a lot of these bodies have changed in terms of who's on them. And the election denial movement has been very focused on taking control of these election bodies at both the county and state level to either try to make it harder to vote by doing things like closing polling places or cutting back early voting hours, or potentially not certifying the election outcomes if a Democratic candidate wins a close election, like we saw them try to do in North Carolina in 2024. And so this election denial movement, this is one of the big takeaways of my article, this election denial movement is a lot more organized than it was in 2020, when it was very much seat of the pants effort by Trump. They are in positions of power in ways that they weren't in 2020. And so it doesn't mean that elections won't be certified, but in places like North Carolina and places like Georgia, there are more obstacles to certifying them than there were before. And Trump can try to influence these bodies just like he's trying to influence these bodies at the state legislative level and urging people to gerrymander. He could exert the same kind of pressure on some of these local election or state election bodies. And there might be a different result this time, or at least a fight that then goes to court that gets very drawn out and leads people to lose confidence that their ballot might be counted.
Ari Berman, Mother Joan, voting rights correspondent. We're spending a lot of our time on this show these days covering this year's election, but I thought it was important enough, with so much that you document that's going on this far in advance of the congressional midterms next year, to take a little detour and talk to you today. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Brian. Always great to talk to you.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. I'm Bridget Bergen, sitting in for Brian today. When you apply for a job today, chances are the first set of eyes on your resume isn't human. It's a piece of software scanning for keywords. Maybe later, a chatbot will interview you, or an algorithm will evaluate your facial expressions. Good luck for those of you with no poker face. Employers say these tools save time and money, helping them sort through the flood of applications, but there's mounting evidence they also screen out qualified candidates, reproduce old biases, and turn hiring into an arms race where both sides are relying on AI. Hilke Schellman has been tracking this story. She's an investigative reporter, a journalism professor at NYU, and author of The Algorithm: How AI Decides Who Gets Hired, Monitored, Promoted, and Fired, and why we need to fight back. She joins us to talk about how algorithms are remaking the hiring process, what is working, what isn't, and what it all means for the job market. Hilke, welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you so much for having me, Bridget.
And listeners, have you encountered AI in your own job search? Were you interviewed by a chatbot, or are you using AI to aid your job search in any way? And for you employers or recruiters, tell us how you're using AI in the hiring process and why. Job seekers and employers, help us report the story about how AI is remaking the job search right now. What have you encountered? 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. You can call or text with those stories. Hilke, when someone applies for a job online today, what usually happens to the resume right after they hit send?
Yeah. So, we all know these big job platforms, right? Like LinkedIn, ZipRecruiter, Monster, all of those. So they all use AI, right? Because, often for jobs, like some employers get thousands of applications, right? And they don't want just a folder with thousands of resumes, right? They would like to have a ranking. So what we see is AI or algorithmic tools will parse the resumes for keywords, maybe compare them to the job description. Sometimes we see tools that are built on folks who are currently successful in the job, and it will sort of make an assessment and a prediction how much you're qualified for the job. and basically sort of generate a yes and no pile for recruiters and hiring managers, right? Because they are overwhelmed. We already saw this before the advent of generative AI, that companies, like Google said, they get over 3 million applications a year. IBM gets over 5 million or so. And now we see even more of those because candidates can now use ChatGPT and other large language models to aid them with their resumes, right? So like we
Sure.
see like sort of an overwhelmingness and a lot of companies turning to AI. It's already built into the job platforms. We also see it built into applicant tracking systems that a lot of large companies use. They used to be a glorified spreadsheet, right, where you check like, okay, this person applied, we interviewed them, or we rejected them. You would track applicants, but now these tools also have mostly AI built in, and so it's used for that as well.
And so, Hilke, when you describe this, you mentioned Google, you mentioned IBM. So is this really something that's just being used in the tech space, or how widespread is AI use in hiring?
Yeah.
And where sort of are the most common points where applicants will be encountering it?
Yeah. So we see it's like very widespread. We know from surveys that even a couple of years ago, 99% of Fortune 500 companies were using this kind of technology, different ways. But we see this usually at very large companies that have to hire a lot, have high turnover, retail, large chains, right? We also see this in like investment banking
Mm,
and other sectors. And then we also see it even for mid-size and smaller companies because the job platforms now cater to them, right? Like sort of like LinkedIn Recruiter and others, they use this kind of technology to cater to smaller places. But if you apply to a like small nonprofit art company that has 3 employees, they're probably not going to use this, right?
sure.
So this is for large companies to get a volume of applicants. Also, it's often used for recent college graduates, right? Because you have often an influx of people applying. They don't have a big work history. They don't have 10 years of experience. So a lot of companies use AI there as well.
Your reporting found that algorithms seem to reward resumes that mention different words that have different connotations. Like the word baseball is rewarded, but the word softball is penalized.
Yeah, yeah. So I think
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, those are like really those were really disturbing findings, right? When I set out, I thought like, oh, AI is moving into HR. This is probably like a good thing, right? And then I started talking to folks like lawyers and psychologists who are at the table when like AI vendors pitch a tool and companies may want to buy a tool. Some of them do their due diligence and bring in outside counsel. And what they have found, one lawyer told me all of the tools were had a deficit. Another said 1 in 4, and they found different keywords that some of these resume parsers or screeners use. So in one example, if you had the word baseball on your resume, you got more points. And if you had the word softball on your resume, you got fewer points, which kind of probably points to gender bias, right? Because in the
Sure.
US, more women play softball and men play baseball. I have that as a hobby. And that doesn't come from like sort of parsers that just look at the job description because this wasn't a baseball or softball job, right? This was just a generic desk job.
Hmm.
So I think what happened here is, and that we see too, is like some companies use resumes from current employees to build some of these AI tools, and the AI tool probably did what it does best. It does a pattern analysis, it does a statistical analysis, and I guess in this company, maybe it had hired more men in the past. They were into baseball, right? Like it found this was a predictive keyword and use that. So unfortunately, we have to think about like AI isn't like a moral entity. It doesn't understand sort of these things that we should be looking for in the job search. And obviously, we shouldn't look at your hobbies because they can say about more who you are or your gender than actually your skills or capabilities, right? So other examples were like in one case, African American was used as a keyword. Another case were locations, like if you had the word Syria or Canada on your resume, obviously that can be, that might be discrimination based on national origin, right? Another case was the word Thomas was a predictor for success. So if you had that word on
Interesting.
your resume, that probably points to more sort of hiring bias in the past, right? That some companies, we know, especially in tech jobs, we have a larger gender disparity. So that
Sure.
might be hinting at that. And then if we use that data to build these algorithms, obviously that bias that is built into the data will be amplified here. And I think that's sort of the concern that I saw over and over again.
I want to credit my producer with this insight from what you've told us so far. It sounds like we should all change our names to Thomas Baseball, and our resumes will do better as we're applying for some of these open
Yeah,
positions.
I know. In some cases, right? Like this is like sort of a problem as well that often the AI tools are calibrated for different companies or for the different sections within a company. So like some of the advice I can give, like it's not always going to be the same thing, right?
Sure.
So like
Well,
maybe baseball will help, but I'm not sure if it will help all the time.
so Hilke, I want to bring in some of our callers who I know have questions and
Yes.
stories. Let's go to Carla in Garfield, New Jersey. Carla, you're on WNYC.
Hi, I am. So yes, so I have a story. So I didn't have a job early this year, and it took me. I applied to so many jobs. It didn't work. It was a couple of months. I didn't have a job, and then my husband's friends advised me to use these AI tool, that he gave me. And once I start using, then it will kind of match the job description with my experience. And sometimes it will be, words can be said in different ways. And because they match it, after I fixed my resume, I got more interviews, and I got a job after a couple of weeks. So definitely that made a difference for me to find a job.
Carla, that's a very promising story. Can I ask you what field you were looking for work in?
Yes, medical device.
Okay, great. I mean, Hilke, it sounds like for some of the concerns that have been raised in terms of potentially replicating biases that, in building some of these AI tools, there may also be some opportunity for job seekers to be able to, improve their odds, game the system, however you want to say it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's like tools out there for job seekers that help you. And I always suggest that to job seekers, like find those tools, like load up the job description, load up your resume, and it will tell you how much overlap probably most AI tools will predict that you have with the job. Aim for like 80-90% of overlap. Don't aim for 100% because some AI tools will throw you out. Because they think you just copied the job description. So definitely use those to your advantage. Also, like think about like we see a lot of like companies turning to skills-based hiring, looking less at your credentials, like what school you went to, if you have a bachelor's degree, and that's generally that's a good thing. So you want to make sure that on your resume you have like a skills section clearly labeled and have all the skills, including soft skills, on there, so that a parser can actually like find that information and parse it in the right field. So definitely, I think it can be absolutely helpful to folks. And I've heard from so many job applicants, kind of like Carla, that they apply, and it's like hundreds of applications.
Sure.
And I think you can use AI to streamline and like sort of try to help you, but often it's like it's really not you. This is just a numbers game, and the numbers are against you. And some folks sort of joke that they feel like, well, companies use AI, now candidates use AI. It's AI against AI. May the better AI win. And I think that's a little sad, but that's what we see right now. It's this AI race on both sides.
I want to bring in Dante from Brooklyn. Dante, you're on WNYC.
Hey, how you guys doing? Thank you for having me on. I was recently interviewed by an AI HR rep, and to use your term, it was a sadly pretty pleasant experience. What I mean is that like the AI has all the time in the world. It's not a real person. So it asked me very probing analytical questions about my resume that I think a real person who has a real agenda and a real time crunch wouldn't ask. For instance, so I am a writer and a TV producer, and usually I get interviewed for my TV producing roles, and the HR AI asked me about some of the short essays and short stories I've published that I've listed on my resume, which was actually a weirdly very touching, and let me talk for 5-7 minutes at a time. I think it was probably, looking for my face, like how my face interacted on screen and the economy of words that I used as well. But yeah, it was definitely not a bad experience, just markedly different experience.
Wow, Dante, thank you so much for that story. It's really fascinating. It feels like sort of almost sci-fi to me, since I haven't experienced it yet, Hilke. But he does raise this idea of, that some of these tools are being used to investigate emotional analysis that try to read candidates' facial expressions. How widely used is that kind of technology?
That luckily is not totally in widespread use, but we have seen this by one of the largest providers if a few years back, a company that all my students know because they're so ubiquitous in the world of one-way video interviews, where Dante has this like kind of new experience that you have like sort of an avatar talking to you, right? An AI tool that is asking you questions. What is, I think, a little bit more ubiquitous is like where you have no one on the other side. You get a link and you log in, and then, maybe a video pops up and saying like, hey, thank you for applying to company B. We have some questions, like, why are you excited about this job? Then you get a couple minutes to prepare, and then you basically record yourself answering. And what we've seen, some companies use like emotional expression analysis. So they would check like, sort of your facial expressions. Like if you were smiling, the tool would presume you're happy. If you're frowning, it would, presume maybe you're upset. And it would also compare it to people who have taken that same job interview earlier for that company, and they were now hired. So those are the successful employees, and it would like sort of compare you to that. I was first like totally blown away when I saw that, and I was like, wow, what an interesting new way to hire. And then I started talking to experts who said like, wait a second, like there's no science here. Like we don't know what facial expressions are predictive of your success in a job interview. You're not even on the job, right?
Sure.
So there are all kinds of problems. The largest company in the space did drop the technology, but it's a little bit like a whack-a-mole, because now I've seen, again, other companies crop up that use this. They also use intonation of voice analysis. Same problem, like it's actually not predictive. And probably a lot of listeners can relate to this. Like I have also like in job interviews, smiled a lot, even though I wasn't happy. A computer vision technology would assume I'm happy if I'm smiling, if it would detect that.
Sure.
But obviously I'm not happy, right? You can also see that there's like so many false positives here. But Dante, I'm really glad to hear that you had such a positive experience. And I think one of the good things that like AI in hiring has brought to the table is like what we call, what experts call structured interviews, that everyone gets asked the same question. Because the problem is, and I'm not advocating to go back to the good old ways of like sort of traditional hiring with humans involved, because humans have a lot of bias too, right? Like we know that humans don't spend a whole lot of time on resumes. They have no time to prepare for job interviews. We often like chat with them, right? Oh, we went to the same school. That's so cool. And that's totally, I get it. You want to make a human connection with an interviewer, but the interviewer, as soon as you like went to the same school or you have something in common, sees you differently and doesn't always look just at your like skills, capabilities, your experience to really judge you for the job. So I think AI can be hugely helpful. I just found out that some of the ways that it's been applied, it's just sort of automated sort of old problematic things to begin with, and that has led to like these biases and consequences. But I'm so glad, Dante, you had a great experience.
Yeah, I'm glad that you also kind of picked up on his enthusiasm, because I think as someone who is learning about AI, as many of us are, I think the default is to have some skepticism and to be concerned about the potential consequences, particularly for workers who already face some disadvantages. I'm thinking of older applicants, people of color, people with disabilities.
Yes.
Are there detrimental effects to those types of applicants when these two tools are so widely used?
Yes. So I think the clearest way is when you think about folks with disability. So one of the things that I I did so many one-way video interviews and all these and tested all this kind of technology. And one of the things that employers send to often like recent graduates is like games to understand their personality, right? They don't have a long work history, so let's find their personality if they're a good fit here. And you play sort of, they advertise it of video games. It's more like a 70s or 80s, like, very early on as aesthetic. And one of the things is like I had to blow up balloons and collect money. And in one of the games, I had to like choose a hard task or an easy task. And when I chose a hard task, I had like 12 or 15 minutes to just hit the space bar as fast as possible. And I was like, what does it have to do with the job? And when I played the game with Henry Claypool, who is quadriplegic, he was really concerned, like, what is if people have a motor disability, right?
Sure.
Like they may not be able to hit the spacebar as fast as possible. They might be absolutely qualified for the job, but they wouldn't be included if they started playing the game, right? And I think we see this again and again that people, for example, people with disabilities are already underrepresented in the workforce. So often these AI tools are trained with the data of current employees. So they're already underrepresented. And even if you have somebody, with autism in the data, there might be somebody who's applying who's also autistic, but their disability sort of comes out very differently, right? So much individual expression of disabilities that, a system that's built on sort of statistics and pattern recognition may not be able to catch all those people. So that's a real concern here, that it sort of amplifies
Sure.
those biases and pushes people who are already on the margins further to the margins.
Let's sneak another call in. Let's go to Henry in Brooklyn. Henry, you're on WNYC.
Hi, I'm trying to help my recent college graduate son apply for jobs and so forth. And, traditionally the recommendation was keep your resume to one page. But does that even matter anymore since it's all done virtually and via AI and all the rest of it?
Yeah, I can pick that up. Thank you, Henry, for calling. You're totally right. You don't actually have to keep it to one page. The AI will read all the pages. And I think it's also like, we used to give people the advice of like, stand out, maybe colors, 2 rows, like none of that, right? Like we have to now think about like, make your resume machine readable, short, concise sentences, anything that can be quantified. Don't say that you saved your company millions of dollars, like exact amount, be very clear and descriptive so an AI tool can pick up on that, right? So I think those are some of the tips that I can give. And, if you still want, some people feel like, oh, now it's like sort of this resume geared towards machines with like a list of skills. My personality doesn't shine through. So you can always bring, like further down in the hiring funnel, right? At the beginning, we see a lot of AI tools that are being used for rejection, but, usually a human still does get involved at the end, right? When there are like 5-10 candidates left, a human will still do a job interview. For that interview, you can bring your beautiful human, quote unquote, resume, right? And your one pager where you have everything with you. But before that, you have to target it towards machines because that's what you're most likely to encounter in the early stages of hiring.
And I think you're sort of answering it, but just to underscore it, are there some, steps that you recommend to people to avoid being unfairly filtered out in those early stages?
Yeah. So I think one thing that I was really surprised by, there is a large survey of over 2,000 employers that a Harvard business professor, Joe Fuller, did. And he found out that when companies use AI and algorithms, almost 50% are programmed that if you have a longer than 6 months break in employment, they will immediately reject you. So you could be the most qualified candidate. If you have that break in your work experience, the tool will throw you out.
Wow.
So I think that's really concerning because it obviously has nothing to do with your capabilities or your job, your skills, anything like that. So I always suggest to people, like, maybe you were freelancing during that time, that you were taking care of your parent or if you can't, right? Like maybe like try to close that gap. I think also these AI tools that I've mentioned online can be really helpful to sort of make sure that the keywords of the job description are found in your resume, right? Like don't be cute and try to use like synonyms. You may encounter a very basic AI tool that cannot decipher that. So like use the exact, keywords from the job description. That's probably what they're looking for. Also like put in like all of your skills and put in soft skills too. Like we see people looking for team efforts, like high stress environments, all of that can be really helpful. And, there's no limit. The AI is not going to discriminate against you if you have a lot of words on your resume, right? Versus a human hiring manager who doesn't have enough time to go through it. An AI will read everything.
Hilke, I'm thinking back to our previous caller, Carla, who talked about how she, revamped her resume and was able to find more opportunities. And we're glad that she found a position in medical sales. When people are trying to do that, are there specific tools that you recommend for job seekers to use? And I know you noted you shouldn't try to match things 100%. So, when you say that, what specifically are the types of tools, that people should consider? Are we talking ChatGPT, or are there things that are more targeted for this type of job seeker?
Yeah, there's a couple companies. One is called JobScan, where you upload the job description and your resume will tell you how much overlap there is. So I would definitely recommend that. You can also use a chat bot, of course. And I think those are really, really helpful to sort of help you streamline your resume in the age of AI. And I think also, other things that are helpful, I've heard from others who had sort of the same problem with Carla, right? They didn't get any traction. They actually started, and I know this is very controversial for recruiters, but when they knew, this is recruiter A, they would contact them on LinkedIn and send them a message and send them their resume. And that's how they found a job. They said they were a software developer, they had 146 applications. And that's how the only time they got traction is like hitting up recruiters through like an email message on LinkedIn. And that's how they got hired. There are different strategies here that you can use. I've also heard now that companies are so overwhelmed with like intake from LinkedIn and other job platforms that they also shift more towards referrals. So if you know somebody in the company who can refer you, obviously that carries the potential of bias and problems, right? You might hire the same people again and again because people bring their friends to the company. So that might be, you might hire more people in the same, and there might be more bias in that.
But it might be helpful for the job seeker.
Yeah, because, I do have like, I sort of understand employers that they're like just reeling under like the deluge of resumes, right? And also people who are not, anyone can apply. So they also get people who have like, I have nothing to do with the job. We also see a lot of the rise of fake applicants, deep fakes trying for jobs, right?
Yeah, and we didn't even get to touch
a lot of struggle.
We didn't even get to touch on that today, and we know that is a big part of this, but we have to leave it there for today. Hilke Schellmann is an investigative reporter, assistant professor of journalism at New York University, and author of The Algorithm: How AI Decides Who Gets Hired, Monitored, Promoted, and Fired, and Why We Need to Fight Back. Hilke, I'm just going to read you a brief part of a text a listener wrote in from a tech lawyer, AI skeptic, that called your book brilliant. She writes, so that non-techies can understand complex technical issues clearly, and she combines that with a nuanced discussion of bias and social justice. I've recommended this book to everyone who wants to understand the important issues AI raises, and always included in AI presentations and panels. Brava. Hilka, thank you so much for joining me. I know, I thought I'd leave you on a
Thank
good
you.
note.
Anonymous text messenger. That is, the best take on the book. And I really tried to, I found people who are already affected by this. And I wanted to tell the technology through their eyes, because I think that's
Right.
what really gets us, right? It's not only
Thank you.
about the technology, it's about the effect on all of us.
Thank you so much, Hilka. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, and for the last few minutes of the show, we're opening up the phones for a call-in on the question, what are some made-up words that only your family says? Obviously, after being through another round of heavy conversations today, we're going to end on a lighter note. This time it's the question, what are some made-up words that only your family says? 212-433-WNYC, call or text 212-433-9692. Why do we ask this? Well, there was a story this month in the Washington Post about how families have made up words that only they use. It's like a family dialect. So linguists call this a familect. There's actually a linguist word for those words that have come up only in your family, often because a little kid mispronounces something, right? Or something like that. They call it a familect. Many words in the family lexicon pop up when kids mispronounce something and then stick, or just make up a word when kids are really little, and then those words linger in the family for years, maybe generations. Who has one? 212-433-WNYC, and a story behind it. 212-433-9692, call or text. Few examples from the article, and I'll throw one in from me and from our intern Vito. Dipady, D-I-P-A-D-E-E, I think I'm saying it right. Dipady, for any condiment that you dunk your food into, like ranch or ketchup. Dipady. Noo-noos, for noodles. Bye-bye, meaning literally go to sleep, but also figuratively as in my computer went bye-bye. So before we go bye-bye at noon, give us a ring to tell us about a word from your family dictionary. Oh, they're flooding in already, so I'm going to stop this in just a second. A pick from our intern, Uncle Bicey. That's a jumbled up version of the phrase, unbuckle my seat. It's Uncle Bicey. Let me say it right. Uncle Bicey, for unbuckled my seat. That, I guess that our intern said to his mom when he was 5 years old and he couldn't unbuckle his seatbelt. Uncle Bicey. Over the years, it's morphed into needing to buckle up, as in, wait, don't pull out of the driveway. I need to Uncle Bicey. And I have one from a branch of my family where someone as a little kid called the Verrazano Narrows Bridge the Nazo. So it became the Nazo Bridge forever. Do you have any words like that have changed meaning over the years? And thanks to the Washington Post for the article that inspired this. Looks like we're going to get a bunch. 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. Call or text, and we'll take them after this. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Well, judging from our caller board and our text stream, everybody has these stories of made-up words that only your family says. Let's just cut through a bunch of these. Misha in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Get us started. Hi, Misha.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. A word that was used a lot in my family was when someone annoyed you was "udge." So they were an udge.
Thank you very much for not being an udge. Monique in Tarrytown, you're on WNYC. Hi, Monique.
Hi, good morning. We use the word peek in order to say Windex for the glass tabletop in the kitchen. Kind of onomatopoeic for the Windex.
Sound that it makes when you spray it. Yeah?
That's right. So you peek the table.
Thank you very much. John in Manhattan, you're WNYC. Hi, John.
So the in-laws have a word we've been trying to find the root of for many years. It's called mudgel, and it's like a mudgel, put a little mudgel in of something into a recipe. Sometimes you could mudgel into a conversation. It's a little of something. Any ideas?
Of what the origin might be? No. Maybe it was one of those things that some little kid said. No, I don't have any ideas. If anybody does, text it to us if you've ever heard mudgel used as a word for those things. Some of the texts coming in: Gaborka, meaning nothing; dishy for dishwasher; foofing for sighing; he foofed; gungalunga for when something is delicious. It's so gungalunga. Blipper for TV remotes. Pick up the blipper. Toe stickers for flip-flops. And Olivia in Brooklyn has one. Hi, Olivia, you're on WNYC.
Hey, Brian. Thanks for taking my call. My family uses this word that's holishing, which I always thought was maybe like a Yiddishism, but I think it's totally made up, which is the feeling of like getting into clean sheets in your bed and you move your feet around and it feels so good and comfy. It's really evocative. I don't know if there's any other way to describe that feeling.
Yeah, holishing around in your bed after laundry day.
Yeah.
Olivia, thank you very much. Lynn in Spring Lake, you're on WNYC. Hi, Lynn.
Hi, how are you? Yes, our word is higgle, and our definition is a crazy hairstyle. And the reason why it developed is our family sits around playing the dictionary game, and we all voted for that definition, which of course was incorrect. And it has stuck around for almost 20 years. We always get a good laugh when someone walks by, and we say, "Oh my gosh, look at that higgle," and the person has no idea what we're talking about.
He. Have you seen that Jennifer Coolidge commercial with the higgle that's running? Never mind. Lynn, thank you very much. Eileen in Livingston, you're on WNYC. Hi, Eileen.
Hi. We call Parmesan cheese shaky cheese, even though there's no people small enough that cannot pronounce Parmesan anymore. It's just stuck. It's shaky cheese.
I think if you say shaky cheese, almost everybody is going to think Parmesan. So that's cool. Eileen, thank you. Kyle in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Kyle.
Hi. The word is doer boss, as in the boss of what we're going to do. Apparently, I said it when I was a kid because I wanted to have some say in the family activities, and my family never let me forget it.
I like that one. We could apply that to some of our political discussions, too. You're not the doer boss of me. Kyle in Brooklyn. Some more that are coming up in texts. As a child, I called a bent antenna on a car a bentamentina and was furious. No one knew what I was talking about. Now we all like to point out bentamentinas. Another one, prubles for difficult issues. Prubles. And can I even say this? Poco-picamites. Something like that, from the spelling, poco-picamites for strange noises in the house. I hear some poco-picamites in the wall. Trajaster for a combo of tragedy and disaster. It's a trajaster. And Hannah in Cambridge, Mass. You're on WNYC. Hi, Hannah.
Hi. We in my family call rubber spatulas pot lickers, because it's a much better word than rubber spatula, and it's the word in my mother's language. And we never knew that other people didn't call it that because it's such a good descriptor.
And rubber spatulas have come under a lot of scrutiny these days for some of the PFAS in them, or maybe it's more of the hard plastic and not the rubber, but I don't know. But that's a story in the health press. Can we get one more in? How about Paul in Brooklyn? Paul, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking my call. The origin of this word, my brother tells me, is it was the name of a demon he and his friends invented that lived in the stairway. But what I remember is that he used this word. He hated school when he was about 8 years old. And he would run into the house, rip off his clip-on top.
It was Buchanoi for Thank God It's Finished, which unfortunately we are now. Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.